Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this podcast, we talk about the stories behind songs and artists, as well as moments in history and sometimes history in the making. Now, I promised you on the last episode, we were going to be talking about Britney Spears and what 2021 roughly to 2024 has looked like for her. We're still going to do that, okay? But May 19th is Pete Townshend's birthday, and he will be 79 years old. And for some reason, I was on a plane flying from LA back to Nashville. And for some reason, I thought he was 80. And I got really excited for a second. I'm like, wow, Pete Townshend is 80. And then I looked it up and I think he's only turning 79, but not only, I think he's only turning 79. He's turning 79. Now, I thought we could do like a big 80s birthday bash for him. We are 1 year shy of that. But regardless, I still want to do a very special episode where we all wish him a very happy birthday. And consequently, he gets his own Roots Rockumentary. So please join me on this very special Roots edition where we dig up the roots of Pete Townshend's amazing career and mark on music history. Pete Townshend is known and admired as one of the greatest musicians of our time, most notably known as one of the founding members of the famous rock band The Who. Pete carried the band through the 60s and 70s, writing over 100 of the songs on The Who's 12 studio albums. The Who has had a profound influence on rock bands everywhere, from the 1970s all the way up until today. Pete was born on May 19, 1945, to Cliff and Betty Townshend. His father, Cliff, was a musician, and he spent a lot of time away from his family on tour. Now, his mother, Betty, had a hard time being alone. We'll put it that way. A hard time being alone for an extended period of time. And Betty would turn to other men to entertain her while her husband was out on tour. And then Cliff would come home and he'd question Betty about what she had been doing while he was away. And the two would just spiral back and forth in this very volatile relationship. They were also both very heavy drinkers, which definitely didn't help and definitely, I think, fueled their emotional instabilities. So needless to say, Pete grew up in somewhat of an unbalanced household. When Pete was just a toddler, his parents separated and Pete was sent to live with his maternal grandmother. Now, in Pete's memoir called Who I Am, he claims his grandmother was extremely abusive to him. He says that she would deny him food, and at one point, she even held his head underwater as if she was trying to drown him. Luckily for Pete, a few years into living with his grandmother, his parents decided to get back together. And Cliff and Betty reconciled and bought a house together in a middle-class suburban neighborhood just outside of London. Pete didn't have a lot of friends growing up. In fact, he recalls the only folks he was really close to was a Jewish family that lived in the upstairs unit of his building. Now, Pete wasn't Jewish, but the family upstairs became really close family friends to the Townsends, and Pete became immersed in the Jewish culture through this. But Pete, nonetheless, spent a lot of his time alone as a child, and one of his favorite pastimes was simply getting lost in various fiction novels. It wasn't until Pete was 11 years old on a family vacation when he was first exposed to rock and roll after watching the movie Rock Around the Clock. Apparently, he liked this movie Rock Around the Clock so much, he insisted on watching it multiple times. After watching this movie several times, his parents decided they would let him go to his very first concert in London. And this was Pete's first experience seeing live music. It was Bill Haley, and Pete was mesmerized. In this same year, his family is realizing music is becoming a hobby and an interest for him. So for his birthday that year, his abusive grandmother bought him his very first guitar. Now, like I said, Pete didn't have a lot of friends to begin with, but after being enrolled in school at age 12 or 13-ish, he started to be bullied pretty heavily by his peers. And this drove Pete even further away from having any kind of a social circle. And it drove him more and more towards afternoons and evenings practicing his guitar in his bedroom. Now remember, his father Cliff was a musician, so a lot of what Pete learned on the guitar, he learned from his dad. But Pete also had an incredible and natural aptitude for learning music. A lot of his playing style was self-taught. In fact, many people know Pete Townshend as a guitarist, but he self-taught himself pretty much every instrument under the planet. The ukulele, the mandolin, the banjo, the keyboards, the accordion, the violin, the bass, the drums. I mean, the list goes on and on. Probably more, honestly. I mean, the man can literally play anything. Now, a lot of you have not watched or seen my Roots Rockumentary on the story behind the song White Christmas, but I talk about one of the most famous songwriters in the world in that episode. And similar to Pete, he also was self-taught and never learned how to read sheet music. And Pete Townshend also could not read sheet music. Now, if you saw my Stevie Ray Vaughan episode, you will also know that Stevie Ray Vaughan tried out for his school band and was kicked out of the school band. Well, he wasn't kicked out. He never made it into the school band because he could not read sheet music. But here we are. Pete Townshend also cannot read sheet music. So just a little interesting fun fact and some connections there. Now, in junior high and high school, Pete's mom, Betty, had an antique shop in town, and Pete started to develop an appreciation not just for the beauty of instruments and guitars, but for their history as well. One of the first guitars Pete ever bought himself was a beautiful Czechoslovakian guitar from his mother's shop. As Pete progressed through school, he eventually joined up with a schoolmate to play in a band and quickly realized he didn't have the academic excellence most parents hope their child to have. I don't think Pete was stupid by any means. I just mean he really didn't have the desire to focus on his grades or schoolwork. He was always either practicing his guitar or listening to music. When Pete was 12 years old, his brother Paul was born, and around that same time, he ended up getting in a fight with the drummer, and that band ultimately disbanded because of that. Now, Pete continued to practice his music on his own. The dissolution of that band didn't stop him from playing music, and Pete was still a young spring chicken. He was only in high school at the time, so he had his whole career in front of him. In 1960, when Pete was 15 years old, his second brother, Simon, was born. And Pete's mom, Betty, as you can imagine, now had her hands full with two toddlers, leaving Pete Townshend to entertain himself with his instruments. Now, I'm a little confused about the dates following this, but from what I found, it was 1961, which would have just been 1 year after Simon's birth, that Pete enrolled in his art college to study graphic design. This is interesting to me because he would have been pretty young, unless he graduated high school early or dropped out and went to art school after dropping out of high school. So I'm kind of confused about that. But I can tell you that he enrolled in an art college to study graphic design. And while he was there, he actually ran into Ronnie Wood, who played with the Rolling Stones. Eventually, not at the time. But their paths did cross at this college, and I don't know if they knew each other, became friends. I'd have to look into that more, but I do know that Ronnie Wood from the Rolling Stones also went to the same art college as Pete Townshend. Just a fun fact. They honestly might not have ever met each other because Pete was only there for a very short period of time before he decided to drop out and focus on music. And this proved to be the right decision for Pete quite quickly, because later that year, a bass player for a band called The Detours decided to recruit Pete to be their guitarist. The Detours were primarily pop and jazz, though, and we all know Pete was a born rocker, but he obliged to their set list and ended up having a really good run with these boys. He managed to avoid a lot of the drama that went on with the Detours, and eventually, because of that, became the band's sole guitarist. Now, Pete's mother, Betty, saw the potential in Pete and in the Detours, and through a connection she and Cliff had in the music industry, they got the boys a management contract with a local promoter who started to book them bigger and better gigs. After getting a promoter, though, and getting out onto the scene more and more, they quickly realized there was another band called The Detours.
So we became the Originals,
Right.
and we had to change our name, actually.
Well, there's another group in the East End called the Originals, and we had to rename ourselves.
The New Originals.
New Originals.
Yeah.
So So in 1964, they were forced to change their name, and they couldn't really think of anything. At one point, Pete's roommate, whether it was a joke or whether he was serious, made a comment and said, "The Who?" And everyone kind of looked at him like, "What did you just say?" He was like, "The Who," and they loved it. Now, not long after changing their name, their drummer randomly combusted and was replaced with a more professional, non-combustible drummer named Keith Moon. For the next several years, The Who established themselves as a professional and serious rock and roll band. But along with rock and roll, started to come a few other things too. Things that I can't say on YouTube because they would censor me. So instead of saying drug use, I'll say mug use. By 1966, the band was topping the charts and touring and partaking in a lot of mugs. And in 1968, The Who embarked on their very first US tour. Everything seemed to be going perfect for The Who until September 7th, 1978, when The Who would be faced with their biggest tragedy to date. Just before September 7th, the 32-year-old drummer of the band The Who, Keith Moon, had proposed to his girlfriend, a 28-year-old Swedish model named Annette Walker, and she said yes. On Wednesday, September 6th, Paul McCartney decided to throw a party in honor of what would have been Buddy Holly's 42nd birthday. Keith and Annette attended this party and excitedly announced to everyone that they had just gotten engaged. Keith was over the moon about this. No pun intended. Get it? Keith Moon. And many described Keith as being in really high spirits and really in love. After Paul McCartney's party, Keith and Annette went back to an apartment for an after party. And witnesses there said Keith was perfectly all right. This apartment was owned by Keith's friend named Harry Nilsson and was a beautiful flat located in the West End area of London. Keith and Annette decided to stay in the upstairs bedroom where, interestingly enough, Mama Cass, who was a member of the group The Mamas and Papas, had died 4 years prior in that bedroom. And Mama Cass was about the same age, almost exactly the same age as Keith Moon, when she died in that bedroom. Many people, joking or not, would say that Mama Cass may or may not haunt that room. But Keith and Annette weren't bothered by that, and they thought the upstairs room was a perfect place for them to crash after this party. After Keith and Annette passed out upstairs, Annette woke up around 5:30 p.m., and she tried to wake up Keith. But he wouldn't move, and he wasn't breathing. Emergency services arrived and declared Keith Moon dead on the scene at 5:50 p.m. Now, although he was declared dead at 5:50, it's believed he could have died around 9 a.m. that morning. It's hard to tell exactly, but according to Annette, Keith woke her up around 7:30 a.m., asking her to make him some breakfast. No one really knows if Annette made him breakfast and then went back to bed, or if she said no and then fell asleep. But regardless, they both, Annette fell asleep until 5:30 in the afternoon. Newspapers immediately reported it was the mugs. Before a proper autopsy was ever done, by the way, all of the newspapers reported this. And a spokesperson came forward on that day insisting it wasn't mugs. According to one of the newspaper articles from that day, there was a spokesman for the Scotland Yard who said that a pathologist named Keith Simpson, quote, examined Keith Moon's body 24 hours after he had been found and established the cause of death was a substance overdose.
What, in control of your own life?
In control of my life, no.
You're not? Are you in control of your life at all?
Oh, we are certain days.
Certain days.
Yeah.
What do you like the other days?
Quite out of control. I mean, amazingly drunk. Drunk? Mainly, yes.
Right.
It was a really hard time for The Who and for Pete Townshend. Pete especially struggled with what their new normal was going to look like. By this time, 1978, The Who had been the only real premier British rock band that was still intact from the 60s. The Beatles, for example, had broken up 8 years prior, and the Rolling Stones had gone through 2 major personnel shifts through this time. The Who was really the only band that had stuck together, honestly, till death did they part. Now, The Who had been working on an album that same year that they lost Keith Moon, and they decided to move forward with that album. By the end of 1978, they released this album through MCA Records, but performing live was still a really big question mark that Pete especially was struggling with. By the time they released this 1978 album, The Who hadn't done a US tour for over 2 years. And especially back then, being out of sight often equated to being out of mind. So if sales were going to dip for The Who based on a lack of a tour, this could result in some strain on the band members, and fans were a little worried about the fact they hadn't seen them and what the future was going to hold for them. Especially now, with the loss of Keith, it wasn't clear if this could be the beginning of the end for the band. One thing was clear, though, and that is that Pete Townshend was really done with the road life. In an interview Pete gave in August of 1978, he said, quote, this is a long quote, "I'm not saying that I don't want to perform again. It's just that I don't want any more of that bleeping road routine. I've had it. What I've done is slightly shift my priorities. I've put my family first and the band second. Up to now, I always put the band first. The new arrangement makes life more difficult in terms of the group, but I feel like the priorities are in order for the first time. What happened was my family life was damaged by all those years of touring. I've had to work hard at rebuilding it, and I don't think I could do anything again to threaten that relationship with my family. I don't think I could carry on if the band decided to resume extensive touring. I don't feel the band is at a crisis point right now, but I can see that kind of situation coming up, and I'm hoping to ward it off." So these were verbatim Pete's words in 1978. And Pete would often go on to say that it was really after filming Tommy in 1975 and after that 1976 tour that immediately followed Tommy, that he really just collapsed from exhaustion. He said when he returned home from the 1976 tour, he realized that over a period of 10 years, he had just completely destroyed the relationship with his wife. She was feeling very little for him and very little sympathy, and he just realized how much he needed her and needed the stability of a home. And he had a really hard time reconciling in his mind how he could be out on tour, out with the band, and maintain that relationship at home with his wife and his kids, and that harmonious home life. And by the end of 1978 and the beginning of 1979, Pete put himself in a totally different schedule. He was working in the studio Monday through Friday, just like a regular office job, where he would write songs or work on film projects. And if the band wanted to get together, he was always pushing them to meet up earlier in the day so that he could make it home for family dinner. In addition to prioritizing his family and walking away from the chaos of his previous schedule, it seemed like Pete might have been reevaluating how he felt about rock and roll in general. And I think people got a little bit nervous as he gave these interviews and as he spoke out about his change in rhythm that he might be abandoning rock and roll. But Pete was very quick to correct people and would always insist and say, quote, "I still believe in the power of rock." He said, quote, "To me, it was always a way to inspire people and to make them aware of what was going on. I tried to produce pieces of music that people could not only listen to, but identify with. The ultimate goal is to make it appear by example that all problems can be transcended by people coming together with optimism, joy, and aggression. That was the idealism I always attached to rock and roll." He also said, quote, "I've come to realize that we've also got to judge rock by the end product, the human beings behind it. If what we do is burn ourselves up and end up in a swimming pool suffering from oversedation, then rock and roll is no answer to anything. I used to be obsessed with keeping the Who together at any price, but I don't know if that's reasonable. Look at the Rolling Stones. What's it going to take to keep them going? more mug busts. I'm sorry, I have to say it that way. Broken marriages, and God knows what else. He said, so I'm not obsessed about The Who going on anymore. Maybe we'll continue forever and ever. I don't know. But I do feel good about the individuals in the band because I've discovered they're sympathetic to me as a human being. They're very keen to tour and to do the old boogaloo, but they also understand how I feel. He went on to say that he hoped they could work out a way to do a tour with some good batches of shows where he didn't have to be away from home for more than 8 days or so at a time. He said he thought it was possible, but every time they went to arrange it, the schedule would just get all out of whack and the whole thing would fall apart. But he always said that he hoped they could find a way to do it and to make the schedules work. They must have worked out that schedule because Pete, the band, and Who fans everywhere got what everyone wanted, a 1980 tour to support their 1978 album, by the way, which was called Who Are You? I don't think I ever said the album name. That album in 1978, Who Are You? All the original Who members, obviously except Keith Moon, who was there in spirit, but all of the other original members, Roger Daltrey, John Entwistle, and Pete Townshend, and Kennedy Jones. Kennedy Jones was the drummer who replaced Keith Moon. Kennedy replaced Keith in 1979, I believe, but all of them were there on this tour. And it was almost like The Who was reborn, and fans got an entirely new life out of the band. And it wasn't until June 27th, 2002, when The Who experienced their second tragedy. This happened when John Entwistle died in room 658 at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. John was just 57 years old at the time of his death. He had a heart attack, and it was just one day before the band's 2002 U.S. tour was set to kick off. A spokesman for the fire department on scene assured the public there were no mysterious or suspicious circumstances surrounding this death, but nonetheless, it was a really shocking tragedy for the fans and, again, for Pete Townshend especially. And with John's death now, there were just 2 original Who members, Pete Townshend and Daltrey. Pete spent the next 2 decades living in a beautiful home in London, England, which he recently sold in 2021, by the way, for 15 million euros. Not bad. He also owns 3 other homes where he splits his time. And like I said, on May 19th of this year, 2024, he is now officially 79 years old on his 80th year of life, and still very much so a staple and face of the music industry. Just recently, at the end of March 2024, he made an appearance at the Broadway show Tommy, and then on The Tonight Show. So he's definitely still out there, out and about, and you still have a chance to ooh and ah over him and his talent. Because not only is he a major influence and mentor to current-day guitarists, he's also used his fortune to help keep the music industry alive and well. In December of 2023, Pete donated, which was reported as a, quote, generous amount, I can only imagine how much it was, to kickstart a live music recording studio in Birkenhead, England, which is right near Liverpool. The goal of this studio is to engage isolated and lonely musicians who might not have gigged for a while. And if you remember, in Pete's early life, he was a loner. He didn't have a lot of friends. So I love that he is now giving back in this way, especially for folks who might be experiencing loneliness and this musical rut later in their life. After this venue was built, it became just flooded with musicians who were all super active and touring and playing nonstop gigs in the 60s, but had now found themselves post-guitar life, guitar daddy life, in this quiet guitar retirement. By the way, I am coming out with a line of mugs that say Guitar Daddy. I'm very excited about these mugs because I have pegged the phrase Guitar Daddy for years, and everybody has laughed at it. It's just been such a funny phrase that I've used throughout my life. I say guitar daddy and I say boat daddy for anyone who has a boat. So I'm coming out with boat daddy and guitar daddy mugs, even though boat daddy isn't really for roots. One of my biggest hobbies is boating. So there you have it. You can get a guitar daddy or a boat daddy mug on the same platform that you can also buy a Divine Music Intervention mug. Ta-da! I'll put the links in the description down below too. But all the donations Pete has made to this studio were through a charity he had started in 1976. And that charity had just grown and pivoted in so many different ways, helping so many different causes. I'll put the link to the charity in the description down below. You can go check it out for yourself, and there's a link there to donate any amount that you would like. But it's just really refreshing and nice to see all of the good things that Pete has done with his music and with his family and with his fans and just with everything. I'm also going to link the official website for The Who's tour schedules. Now, while I don't see any upcoming shows for The Who specifically, I do see a ton of upcoming shows for Roger Daltrey. The next one, I believe, will be at the Keswick Theater in Glenside, Pennsylvania on June 10th, 2024. And of course, we have reached the part of the Roots Rockumentary where I want all of us in the comments to wish Pete a happy birthday. And if you have a favorite Pete Townshend or The Who memory, please comment it down below. This is going to be so much fun. And if you like this type of content and want to support Roots music history, subscribing is free and is obviously the best way to support the channel at no cost. But you also have the option to give me a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount that you would like. Anywhere from, I think it's $1.99 to $199. But these donations are so imperative to helping continually improve the quality of the episodes, but also to cover all of the monthly expenses associated with this programming. I am just forever grateful to anyone who has ever given me a super thanks. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary. And happy birthday to Pete Townshend, the Who Daddy.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.